All right, welcome to the Provocative China podcast again. I just had a fascinating interview with Ross Adams. And the reason I interviewed Ross is because he's a historian, he's a futurist, and he's an author who writes about, he writes about different things, but he writes about China. So his upcoming book is called The Siberian Question, and it takes place in China, in a situation between China and Russia over the next 5 to 10 years in the future. We're all curious what's going to happen with China geopolitically in the future. And this podcast will give a version of the future by Ross Adams, author of The Price of Water. And his upcoming book is The Siberian Question. All right. So I am here with Ross Adams. And, before we get into talking about your books, I want our audience to learn a little bit more about you. So let's talk a little bit about your personal journey, maybe the places you live, the people you've loved, and of course, your evolving career. I want them to connect the dots from where you started to how you became a published author and now working on your next book.
Well, that's a very open-ended question. So I guess the question is how much detail are we going to go into in this? Um, but to summarize, I grew up on the East Coast, U.S., in and around the Philadelphia area, and was very fortunate in having quite a number of travel experiences as I was growing up, and I think that's colored everything I've done in my life since. And so, I think the first international travel experience I was 10, and my family we took a ski trip to Austria, and I have three siblings, so there were six of us. So this is quite an undertaking for for a family, and we're all very close in age. So I think my oldest brother was maybe 13, my sister was maybe 7 or 8, and so you imagine a family like that flying to Europe and then going on a ski trip. And the funny thing about that is that we were not skiers as a family. So I don't have any idea why it was we took this trip. Uh, but at the
But,
end of the
but
day,
you're a skier now, so
now I am, I didn't really pick it up and take it up until I was in law school.
right.
So it was so many years later. But the experience, the best part of the experience for me was the other kids that I met in the places we stayed. So we stayed in three different places, and the second place we stayed was Saint Anton in Austria, and we stayed in a family hotel. And the family who owned and ran the hotel happened to have a son who was about my age and didn't speak English. And of course, I didn't speak German, but we were able to play together and have a lot of fun, uh, despite the fact we couldn't actually speak to each other in English or in German. Uh, and it was a fascinating experience to be able to do that with someone who you really couldn't speak to, but you could communicate anyway in a lot of other different ways, which we did. And then the same sort of thing happened in Innsbruck because it was my first time ever skiing, and I hated it because it was cold and the conditions weren't great. And it was hard to do. And so one of the days I just didn't go, and the rest of the family did. My mother and I stayed back at the hotel, and there was I guess it would be a small pond near the hotel where people were skating, ice skating, and that was something I did enjoy. And we had a pond behind our house, which I could skate. And again,
Mhm.
met a German kid or an Austrian kid who was about my age. This one actually did speak some English, which was interesting. Took me home for lunch. It was just, it was like one of those amazing experiences. People were so friendly and so nice. Yeah, it just made the trip really special for me for that reason. The skiing I didn't really care about. It was the experience I had, and of course at the time you don't think about it as a 10-year-old, but in retrospect it was sort of a foundational part of my international experience.
So it planted a seed because you ended up, if I recall, you ended up working in Eastern Europe.
Well, fast forwarding quite a lot, but that was much later, as it turns out. Uh,
Right.
so then, sort of a few years later, I guess maybe even 5 or 6 years later, in high school was the second really big international travel experience. Um, the Latin club in our high school was the most popular club in the school, strangely enough, and it was due for an obvious reason that the Latin teacher was just one of those special teachers that made a dead language literally interesting because he was so knowledgeable and so enthusiastic, not just about the language, but about Roman history, which was a big part of how he taught, and included bringing students into sort of practicing some of what ancient Romans used to do. And every year there would be a Latin banquet, which was incredibly fun. It was essentially a toga party before there were toga parties, and and then every other year was a Latin club trip to Italy, and we would go to. It was during spring break, during Easter, so we were there at the time the Pope would do his Easter address, and we got to. It was basically between Rome and Florence, and you have a bunch of
So,
16 and 17-year-old
so
kids.
this was in high school.
This is high school.
Okay,
Uh,
so I want to connect the dots to today. So we won't. We, so that gives us a clear idea of how you developed a passion for history and became a historian, so to speak. How you developed a passion for traveling and working in different countries and understanding different cultures. That all ties together to kind of what you're doing today as an author, because you've taken your background in history, your passion for predicting the future, and your experience for interacting and understanding different cultures, and now you're writing about it.
right.
So that's what our audience wants to know about. We want to know about you as an author and all of the building blocks that led to you to write about the things that you write about.
Right. So I mean, again, it is the international experiences that I think have colored what I write about.
Right.
And those early ones were, as I say, foundational, and then several other significant trips, between various schools. After high school, I went to Israel, worked on a kibbutz for a summer. After college, I went on. I took a year off and hitchhiked all around Europe. And then after law school and working for a judge for a year, I spent 3 months backpacking in Asia and Australia. So, these were all before I actually then relocated to Europe in the early 90s after the Cold War ended and the Eastern Bloc countries opened up. And that was one of those moments, and it happens once in your life. And the idea of getting involved in that and having those earlier travel experience, in particular, an experience in Berlin when it was still divided and when Germany was still divided, led me to want to get involved in the transformation. And so all those international experiences, living abroad, meeting different people from around the world, and trying to understand who they are and how they think, and all that led to just an interesting perspective and an interest in keeping up on all that stuff. And history, again, the Latin club teacher definitely was foundational for my interest in history. That's what I majored in college, was in history. And I've always tried to keep up on that, read voraciously, historical fiction, and even actual history books. In particular, when I was living in Prague and Warsaw during the 90s, wanting to understand the culture, the history of Poland and Czech and the region. Because funny thing is when we were growing up, we didn't get presented as a history major, and I was a European focus. That was my history major was in Europe. And during the Cold War, they didn't teach you anything west of West Germany or Austria. I mean, sorry, anything east of West Germany or Austria, right? So Polish history, Czech history, Hungarian history just wasn't presented. It was a
So
very
what are
thing.
some of your favorite books of historical fiction?
I would say authors is a better way of thinking about it.
All
And
right. Well,
probably, and probably one of my
who are some of your favorite authors, and how does that inspire you to go on your own journey as an author?
yeah, James Michener probably is my favorite historical fiction author. And he was when he was alive, he was a very prolific writer, and he would basically choose a location and start from before time, before in the beginning of time, meaning literally the geographical formation of a place, and then would find a family that he would trace incredibly enduring genealogy, where this family would be the first cave people in this place, and then their descendants would be the ones who would interact with all the players in that physical location. So I had probably 10 or 15 different books he's written, places around the world, Israel, South Africa, Poland, It was wonderful.
And did reading those books inspire you to also write your own books?
Well, I think all the reading I've done have inspired that. I mean, I just, again, I think being a voracious reader and having done a lot of writing through high school and college, and even as an attorney, it's a different kind of writing. And I joke about how going to law school ruined my writing skills, and I think it's kind of true as I'm trying to recover them now. That because when you go to law school, they teach you to write in a particular way, and if you pursue a career in law, then you kind of leave behind to a degree, the other writing styles that you might have used in before you went to law school. But
So are you still you're a practicing lawyer now?
I
And
still yeah, I am a full-time practicing lawyer. Yes.
and besides your passion for skiing, your what occupies the rest of your time is now you've become an author, a published author, and now you have many ideas in your head where you want to write many more books, and they all deal with the future, and they all deal with kind of issues that affect us every day today, which is your first book, The Price of Water.
Yeah, so I would just correct that to a degree in that the current books that I'm writing deal with the future and are based on an attempt to predict what's coming based on the current situation and the history
Okay.
of various places around the world. But that is not my ambition is not to be just that kind of a writer. I
Okay.
do want to write historical fiction. I do want to I have a number of ideas that are not necessarily fit in the category you just described, although that is one
But
of
that categorizes the books that you've written and your next book.
that I'm working on right now.
Okay.
Yes. So the price of water for sure is that, and the next book is a prequel to that called the Siberian Question. So yes, these are definitely both in that category.
All right. So I think that was a nice introduction of who you are. Why don't we talk a little bit about your current book before we get into your next book? Tell us a little bit about The Price of Water, how your own experiences inspired you to think about this book. How did you come up with the idea of this book? And tell us how long it took you to write this book and how you got it finally published.
Okay. Um, so the inspiration came, I think, because of a direct relationship to my law practice, right? So one of the areas I practice in is intellectual property, and in particular, what's called patent and trademark prosecution, which means you basically get these inventions protected by getting the applications through the patent office and issued. And so I think the beginning of the inspiration came from, okay, how do I bring in what happens at a patent office uh, when an invention is basically presented to a patent examiner, who is the person who looks at the actual application and decides whether or not it's worthy of getting the protection you want for it. And that was sort of the core of this. And I began thinking about the type of technology that someone might be looking at in the future and what the patent offices might look like in the future. And ultimately, I think what's happening, what will happen, is that right now there's a patent office in every country, right?
Mhm.
But as time goes by, you realize how incredibly inefficient that is. So over time, like many things, efficiency will rule out, and there'll be one patent office, and it will be a worldwide patent office, and every type of technology will then pass through that office. And then the idea was, well, what if there was a very powerful industry that was particularly interested in certain technologies and wanted to be able to be the first ones to deal with that and control the technology, and how would they do that? And it dawned on me a great way to do that would be to corrupt patent agents who or patent examiners who are looking at these new inventions and this new technology. And as soon as they see something, if they're on your payroll, they'll tell you about it. And in those applications are disclosed, not just what the application, what the technology is and the invention is, but who the inventors are and who the other people are that it involved. And so that all led to uh, the concept of, okay, what's coming in the future and what type of technology really matters. And living in San Diego, like I do, water is a constant issue here, right? When it rains, we're happy. And most people in the world, when it rains, they're not happy. Uh,
Right.
and here we have a desalinization plant. It doesn't begin to cover the water needs, even though it produces a huge amount of fresh water. And all that sort of played into, okay, as technology evolves, what's going to be the thing that would actually create fresh water? We have tons of water on this planet, obviously. We have giant oceans. It's most of what's here, but we don't know how to convert that undrinkable water into potable water, and that's an issue around the world today. And so
Okay.
then it
So
was,
so
sort of.
what is the future conflict that is the genesis of the book, The Price of Water?
Well, then there were certain parallels, right? That I think happen, right? So when giant private interests begin to control a particular industry, it gets corrupted, right? And in this case, the supply and distribution of water is a critical thing that we as a species need to happen in a way that allows us to live. But if there's private interest that controls it and the price of it, then suddenly that all comes into question. And so the story evolved into, okay, we have a future where maybe, because as water gets scarcer and scarcer, and that seems to be where we're going as a planet with climate change, and the use of existing water resources, what's going to happen in the future? And it's not unreasonable to think that all these municipal water works will privatize the process of supplying and distributing water, because when you do it for profit, the general idea is, okay, it's going to be more efficient. But then those water companies can grow, and in this book, In the Price of Water, that's
So is
exactly
The
what
Price of Water a dystopian future? A dystopian future novel? I mean, tell our audience what is this book about and what story does it tell?
right. So what it tells is what I just discussed, is a future in 2051 when water becomes scarce because of climate change, fresh water. And the technology to convert fresh water convert non-fresh water, either wastewater or salt water, into fresh water doesn't exist at the scale it needs to in order for everyone to get the water they need. And that results in water riots. It's not really a war, but it's a time when things are really, really bad. And of course, governments are looking to control things and get the water supply. And the industry has evolved so that there are giant water companies around the world that control the water. They have, in this story, uh, corrupted the patent examiners, as I described earlier. So when somebody comes up with the answer, and one of the main characters in the book does, and tries to protect it by filing his patent applications, the big water companies find out about it and try to control it. And the story is essentially of this guy, with the help of with unexpected help, running from the water companies, trying to get to a place of safety, which plays into some of the geopolitics that I talk about in the book, about things that happen between now and then, which lead to some new institutions in the world that are somewhat optimistic. The idea of there being a world government where all the countries in the world give up a certain amount of sovereignty to a United Nations that actually functions as a world government, and certain institutions that are created as part of that process that allow for the world to be policed in an effective way, so that bad actors don't get away with the things they get away with today, and that they're held accountable not in a court like what's in The Hague today, the International Court of Justice, which is kind of a joke, but an actual real world court with a real global attorney general who can really hold people, bad actors, accountable. Uh,
So what is the what how would you classify the genre of this book?
it's a futuristic thriller, is the way that I
Futuristic
describe it.
thriller.
Right.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about the main protagonist and what makes this how do what is the main journey that your characters go through in this dystopian future where water is scarce and intellectual property is controlled by one agency and one patent office and all that stuff? What is the struggle of your main characters and why what makes it a thriller?
Right. So the first character is one of those corrupted patent examiners, and she is a scientist who herself is damaged from earlier experiences in her life, and her arc is one where she is, because of her earlier damaged experiences, doesn't care about what she's doing and just doesn't think about the fact that, the consequences of giving up this information to these large water companies. And she herself was pursuing exactly the same thing that the guy who figures it out was pursuing until she was taken off track by the problems she had when she was younger. She is in her arc. She sees, unexpectedly, a Ghanaian scientist present the answer, a way of purifying water at the scale necessary to solve the water problem. She's seeing that technology pass across her desk. She's disclosed that technology to the bad guys, the water companies, realizes what this guy is in store for, and he doesn't have any idea about what's coming. And her arc is turning to, once she realizes that this is the answer, it reinvigorates her to pursue that again and try to help him from falling prey to these giant water companies, right? And so that's the first character, and she then embarks on an effort to help him survive, literally, when he gets pursued. Now, the other main character is the scientist, a Ghanaian scientist, and again, one of the geopolitical things that happen in the next 30 years is China, as it rises and continues to pursue the Belt and Road Initiative, is successful with that, especially in Africa, where many of the African nations that are today enjoying, or not even say enjoying, but have gotten a huge amount of infrastructure created by China, and certainly the Chinese today are doing it for the same reason every imperialistic power has gone to Africa to do it, because they want to get at the natural resources. But they inadvertently create a renaissance in Africa. A middle class arises because they're bringing back Africans to China to educate them so they can maintain all the infrastructure that's been created. And then those people come back to Africa, and they're themselves establishing universities, education. And this particular character is a beneficiary of that. He is a prodigy as a scientist, is brought to Shanghai, is educated there, is working on this issue. He wants to find the answer to purifying water, and he does. Right. And then, but he does.
Before we continue with that, because this is the reason that I'm interviewing for this podcast is I'm interested in your takes on China. You
Right.
just mentioned that because China is imperialist. Is that what you believe?
Well, the purpose of creating infrastructure in Africa is very much like imperialist countries in the past. So it was just a parallel. Not that China is imperialistic itself, but certainly, you could
Well,
argue.
China could be imperialistic in your future. After all, it's fiction.
Right.
So does China become imperialist in your future?
I don't know that it's imperialist, but it certainly is ambitious, right? Because imperialism means conquering the world, and that just doesn't really happen the same way anymore. I mean, the world has gotten too small for true imperialism, but certainly it intends to be, if not the major player in the world, one of them, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to break that down because you actually used the word, so I wanted to make sure you could put it into context.
Right, and the context was imperialistic, not imperialism, but imperialistic in the sense that that China wants to get at African natural resources because there's a lot there.
Mm-hmm.
The tit for tat, we'll give you infrastructure, you let us have access to those resources, right? So, and that's the way the imperialists used to be. In the colonial period, for example, when Europe had divided up Africa, it was very much the same way, only it was a very different thing. That was true imperialism, where they actually took control of territory and ran it. That's not what China is doing.
Okay, so what would the world call China's behavior in your future?
In the future, in 2051.
In your future of the book, The Price of Water, and the next book, which is what we're going to talk about, The Siberian Question.
Right.
How does the world describe China's behavior? Is it imperialism, or do they have a different word for it?
I don't know. I haven't actually thought about how to describe that. It's not. I don't think it's imperialistic. I mean, I don't think it's imperialism.
Okay.
I think it's more uh, of a return to a place where China was in the past, as again, maybe the major player in the world as a world power. Certainly, in its history, it was that. It was maybe the major player for many centuries. It obviously
Or
fell
millennia,
right many centuries, millennia, right? Fine.
many millennia, yeah. 5,000 years, India and China were, I've heard that, you know, Kashir Abubani talks about, has China won and stuff like that. And the fact that there is a Western-led global world order in the history of mankind, it's an aberration. And so when
However,
China
let's
rises,
not get too crazy about the 5,000 years, because it wasn't for 5,000 years that China was the China it was that ultimately began to fall. It grew over time. Parts of Asia where dynasties arose and they grew more and more. So I don't know exactly when the China of the real world power China.
yeah, well,
This
it's
thing goes
the China and India, not China by itself, but
right.
in the history, the East has basically been the bigger economy, the source of innovation. And then if you look at 5,000 years of human history, the period we're currently living in is an aberration over those 5,000 years. Again, these are theses by Kashir Abubani, who wrote the book Has China Won? So,
Right. And I think but the interesting thing about comparing those types of time periods and today's world is technology has changed everything. The Industrial Revolution changed everything,
mhm,
and the acceleration the last few hundred years during following the Industrial Revolution, you could argue that counts for 1,000 or maybe 5,000 years in terms of how long it would have taken those societies in earlier times to get to where we are today. Yeah, so it's
mhm,
one of those. I mean, it's hard to compare the timeline. Of course, the time is what it is, but things
yeah,
moved much slower throughout the years, the centuries and the millennia before. But today, China is recovering essentially from a time when it fell prey to the fact that Europe had gone through the Industrial Revolution, China had not, and it became as most of Asia had not, and so they were all subject to the reality of far superior weapons that they just couldn't compete with. And so the West had its way for a while.
yeah. So that leads to, so we know a little bit about the price of water. It takes place in 2050 around. The
2050. Yeah.
the Siberian Question is a prequel to the price of water. How are they? Can you talk about how they're related? And I know this, the Siberian Question has a lot to do with China, which is what I'm really interested in.
Right. So the Siberian Question is actually centered on China and Russia,
Right.
an extrapolation from what's happening today and the Ukraine war and the consequences for Russia really in pursuing the Ukraine war and having the Western world, at least up until now, being very much against their attempt to take over Ukraine. Uh, China being its special relationship, I think is what they called it between Xi and Putin.
Friendship with no limits.
Is their main supplier of is their conduit for everything that Russia can't get like it used to get in other ways. And so to me, that looked like an opportunity for China to do something very interesting that no one is really talking about, because most of what the West, at least, and I think other countries around the world talk about when it comes to China and its expansion and its ambitions, you know, it's taken back Taiwan, it's taken back Macau, and it wants Taiwan. I mean, sorry, it's taken back Hong Kong, it's taken back Macau, and it wants Taiwan, right? Because it considers it part of China. And the Siberian Question poses the interesting, or at least what I think is interesting, possibility that the Chinese are using Taiwan as a feint. While they do want it, it's not something they're willing to pursue right now because they understand that the cost would be very high, both in terms of if they wanted to force the issue.
Mhm.
However, because of the dependency that was handed to them, and Russia is such a gigantic country and has so much underdeveloped resource in its far eastern territories. If China were to take those territories for itself, the Russians arguably would not be able to resist if the dependency was deep enough. And in 5 years from now, if the Ukraine war continues, it could be. And at that point in time, China, and this is the Siberian Question, could take a huge chunk of Asia, which is currently territory of Russia to get at all those resources that it needs to continue to pursue its ambitions. And one of those resources is water. Today,
What year does the Siberian Question take place?
well, the working date is 2030.
Yeah, uh, so I'm really curious, and I think our listeners will be curious. What inspired you to write this novel, The Siberian Question, and are you writing it as a warning to anybody who might be paying attention? Just like the price of water, water is going to be a scarce resource sometime in the future. Are you also writing that book as a warning for people to really understand how we're going to preserve the planet by making sure everybody has enough water?
Right. So I think the inspiration for the book is, again, it's a prequel to The Price of Water. So certain things have to happen between now and 2051 in order for the story of The Price of Water to make sense. And one of those things is the continued growth and expansion of China and its influence around the world, which I think is happening today, and it's inevitable, right? The Belt and Road Initiative is working, at some level. The question is, at what level? And I'm extrapolating out to basically anticipate that it will work very well. Uh, but there are some realities that are happening today where China needs to do something, right?
Yeah, I'm
And
curious. When you say the Belt and Road Initiative is working, you're saying it's working for China.
correct,
Okay.
but also working for the recipients of the Belt and Road Initiative if they manage it properly, right?
So potentially it's actually a win-win. The
Correct.
people the people on the opposite side of China in the Belt and Road are going to be pro-China, not anti-China.
And hence the rise of Africa. And so by the time of 2051 and the price of water, Africa and China have this massive geopolitical block because it's been successful there. That's at least the projection.
Oh, I
Right?
see.
And so and other countries that are part of that also can, if they manage it right. Of course, if they don't manage it right, it could be very much an exploitive kind of situation, to benefit China. China would benefit no matter what. At least that's the idea.
That's
But right
China's
now, on
idea.
the northeastern plain of China, where a lot of its biggest cities are, water is already an issue today,
Mhm.
right? And there happens to be, this massive resource of water just to the north of Mongolia, right, in Siberia, in southern Siberia, called Lake Baikal, right? More water, more fresh water in this 400-mile crack in the earth than the Great Lakes in North America combined,
Yeah.
right?
And that's fact. That's not fiction.
That is fact. That is fact. And
Okay.
so, having access to that water for the Chinese could be a very, very important thing. And so part of the Siberian question and the flow through to the price of water is how water is an important theme and remains that through all these books that I'm writing.
Mhm. All right. So tell me about your experience in China, and um, obviously you you've studied kind of historically what has happened in China, and then you're now taking all of those experiences and the things that you write about, and you're kind of projecting how to connect the dots into the price of water, which is 30 years in the future. But we need to understand what happens like 5 to 10 years in the future. What is your um, what is your experience with China? I mean, what made you really curious to think about China, to study China, and then ultimately to incorporate China into your writings?
Right. So I think the initial interest in the history of China is sort of part of my general interest in history from around the world. And so, fortunately, when I was in law school, I didn't take Chinese history courses when I was in college. Just I didn't get around to it because obviously the world's a big place and you can only do so much with the time you have.
Mm.
So I tried to fill some gaps while I was in law school. Fortunately, grad school or graduate level courses were available that would count towards my law degree. So one of those courses I took was Chinese history, which was an incredibly beneficial course. It was very interesting, well taught, and really really galvanized my interest. Uh,
Mm.
and then after the clerkship, when I backpacked through Asia, at the time, this is in the late 80s, and it wasn't clear to us coming from the West that you could get access to China without a very restricted and managed tour with, because the Chinese were very careful about who they let in and where they could go. And so when I was traveling through Asia at that time, this is 1988, it's a long time ago, obviously. Uh, I landed. One of my stops was Hong Kong when it was still a British territory and due to be turned back to the Chinese, 9 years later. It just so happened that there was basically unfettered access to China at that time. You could go from Hong Kong into anywhere in China. It was just one of those very open times, for a short period. It ended with Tiananmen Square in about a year or so later. But during that time, people were coming in and out of China all the time. And a lot of backpackers were riding the trains, with all the other Chinese and going wherever they wanted to go without any restraint. And so I took the opportunity to go into Canton at the time, which was fairly close to Hong Kong, and see what it was like to be in China in 1988. And it was an eye-opening experience, because Canton was one of the more progressive cities historically, and even into the communist period. And at that time, when we arrived in Canton, the only paved areas were right around the train station, right? The center of Canton was all dirt roads, right? And there were virtually no cars. The only way you got around was on bicycles, right? Now, fast forward to the next time I was in China was in 2016, and the last time, uh, things have changed a bit. Uh, so
Yeah.
from that very sort of third world experience into China of today, which is in many respects first world. It was a fascinating progression, and also because of the nature of my law practice, which is very international, when it comes to patents and trademarks, and the respect that different countries have for those intellectual property rights. China was always a big question for us, advising our clients on what to do there. Should I bother filing a trademark in China? Should I bother filing a patent application in China? Right? And the progression was stark. So basically, in the early 2000s, the general consensus in the IP community: don't waste your time or money because there's no way to enforce it. There's no if you get it, which is very difficult to do. What are you going to do with it once you've got it if somebody there infringes one way or another,
Yeah.
right?
There's
And
a
then
saying that that in the West people obey laws, but in China people obey people. So as long as you have the right connections,
right,
if you don't have the right connections, then you're never going to get your case adjudicated properly by
right.
Western
Well,
courts.
predictability is an important part of business, right?
Yeah.
And having a scheme where you have some ability to predict outcomes is important, and that doesn't work that well with that kind of a system. You
Well, it
never.
does. It can work if you have a different mindset. If you predict that you cannot get, like you guys did, if you predict that you cannot enforce your patents, therefore you shouldn't file your patents, then you predict that I just have to assume that my intellectual property will be stolen. And that would have been a good assumption.
Correct, and that's exactly what happened for those who were willing to even risk it. And then as time went on, and as the economy grew, it became a sort of a business necessity, because even though you may not be able to enforce, the economy was growing so quickly and the opportunity was so significant that you couldn't not file. Because again, a patent is a 20-year life. A trademark can be forever as long as you're using it. So as China began to evolve and those institutions began to evolve, the general consensus, let's fast forward to maybe 2010, was you can't really afford not to file there, because eventually China will join the rest of the world in terms of, at least the thought was, in terms of creating institutions, required to enforce rights, so that there was some predictability from a Western perspective, right? Not really taking into consideration how the Chinese operate, but just that was the perspective from the West.
So let's go back to 1988. That was your first time in mainland China?
Yes,
And
first
when you
time in Asia.
first time in Asia, and when you went from Hong Kong to China, did you just walk across the border? Did you take a ferry? to Canton, which I guess now is Shenzhen or Guangzhou.
Right. No, it was a
You took a
train from Kowloon.
Kowloon, and then you did not need to show your passport. You just kind of walked in
You could get a visa very easily at the time.
at the
Uh,
time.
in
But
fact,
you did need a passport.
of course, yes,
Okay.
yes. I mean, this was going from British territory into China, so yes, you needed a passport.
Because like just anecdotally, a couple months ago, I drove from Southern California into Mexico, and I actually didn't need a passport to get in. I just drove straight through. They waved me in. They didn't check any paperwork. Just you're coming from America, welcome. You're here to spend money.
Right? Yeah, but on the way back, you did need a
Yeah,
passport.
they needed a passport to get back in. So, how
Right.
many days did you spend in China?
Well, it was really just a couple of days, and that
A
was
couple
it.
of days.
Yeah.
Did you overnight in China or did you overnight in
Yes.
Hong Kong? You overnighted in
Overnighted in China, in Canton.
Canton. And what was, I mean, was it a hotel? Was it a bed and breakfast? Was it
It
a
was a foreigners hotel. Yes, it was
foreigners
specifically a
hotel?
foreigners hotel. Right.
Okay.
So and it was very basic. But it was nothing. And honestly, I don't recall the details that well of the hotel itself. What I mean, this is 35 years ago or whatever, right? It's a long time ago, and and what I recall, the recollection is mostly the impression of lack of development of relatively speaking, because nothing was paved and there were no vehicles other than bicycles, and and it was just one of those things that was the impression. Again, it's a long time ago, so
So
uh,
people at the foreigner hotel spoke English.
I believe so.
And did you venture out and try to interact with the locals? This is very interesting. Going to China in '88.
Yeah, it was an odd time. I mean, nobody spoke English, so except for the people that were actually catering to the foreigners, and so the everyday people, you really couldn't have a conversation. We just kind of wandered around the city, and just explored. And one of the ironies of I was with two Japanese guys, and
Okay.
that kind of struck me as interesting that an American and two Chinese and two Japanese would go to Canton together and have exactly the same impression. Because
And could your Japanese companions speak Chinese?
I don't think so, but they spoke English.
Okay, but Japanese can read kanji characters, so they could read some of the signs.
Maybe. I mean, I don't recall whether they did or not. Again, it's been it's almost 40 years, so it's it's like one of those amazing experiences. But it struck me that again that it was because again China and Japan have this fraught relationship, and of course they're the U.S. and China were always kind of was the communist time just before the end of it was before the end of the Soviet Union too. So this was at a time when the Cold War was still a thing.
Okay, and then your next time in China was 2016.
Right,
So you had a gap of almost 28 years.
right.
Okay, and then as a as a historian or as somebody who pays attention to this stuff, how do you contrast 1988 China with what you experienced in 2016?
Oh, it's night and day. Night and day. Obviously, it's sort of a little bit like the experience I had in Berlin a few years earlier when it was divided, because I was actually able to go to West Berlin. I hitchhiked actually from West Germany through East Germany to West Berlin,
Mm.
and it was like this island of Westernness in this sea of craziness. This is the way I kind of think about it. And you
Mhm.
were able to go to the eastern side of Berlin at the time. So this is in 1983. So again, 5 years earlier than 1988.
Mhm.
Again, during a hot time in the Cold War, it was the first Reagan term. There was a talk of deployment of Pershing missiles throughout Europe, and limited nuclear war in Europe was seemed to be okay to the Americans, and obviously was not okay to the Europeans. And so when I went to Berlin and went from West Berlin to East Berlin, it was again night and day. I mean, going to East Berlin in those days, it was one of the most bizarre experiences I've had. It wasn't third world like China. It wasn't primitive, kind of like the way China was at the time. But it was going back in time almost. And the guy I was with, just a random person I met at the hostel where I was staying, we went together. He captured the experience incredibly well. He said going to from West Berlin to East Berlin was like going from a color TV to a black and white.
Mm.
All the cars were old, right? They looked like they were from the 1950s. There was basically no traffic. It was eerily quiet, right? No traffic at all. Like all those cars were just parked. There were no people, on the streets. It was kind of just empty. And you had to change a certain amount of money from hard currency into East German marks, and you couldn't change it back, so you had to spend it. But there was nothing to buy. Right? So it was just this really strange. So we took the subway, I guess the subway from West Germany into East. I mean, from West Berlin into East Berlin, and walked out Checkpoint Charlie, right? And this was a time when people were getting shot at the Berlin Wall, right? It was a really crazy experience.
Do you remember eating in Canton in 1988?
I do not.
Okay,
I,
because during that period, uh, to buy any kind of bread, rice, noodle, you needed something called 粮票, which is this is how China controlled the movement of people, because you're given kind of like these food stamps. Everybody's given allocated food stamps, so you're given these food stamps. And without these food stamps, money, you can't buy food without the combination of money and food stamps. And the food stamps are regional. So you needed a 粮票 for Canton in order to buy food in Canton. And if you were given those because of your registration and you traveled to Shanghai, you couldn't buy food because you would need Shanghai 的粮票. You would need the food stamps for Shanghai. And then foreigners who would travel to China would need to get some kind of national food stamp so they could buy food everywhere. I was just wondering if you have any recollection of that.
I really don't. I mean, my vague recollection is that we ate at the Foreigners Hotel, and there we could use hard currency.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so I don't recall trying to buy anything.
Because my first time in China was 83, 5 years even before you.
Right.
And I recall, uh, I have a deep recollection of the food stamps because we were there on a government sponsored trip. My father was doing a tour of the universities, giving lectures in physics. And so we were government sponsored and we were given national food stamps, 全国通用的粮票, which means those things could be used to buy food anywhere.
Okay.
And so that stuck with me. I mean, I was very, very young in 1983, but that incident stuck with me. So I was just curious if you remember that in 88.
No, unfortunately, I don't. I mean, I think that we just ate at the hotel where we stayed.
Okay, so your points of reference for the Siberian question regarding China is 88, you had an experience in China, and then it was 2016?
Yeah, the actual visits. Yes.
2016. And then that 2016 is probably the midpoint between the first time you visited China and the time that the price of water takes place. It's almost like the midpoint.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yes.
so do you think China's development from what you saw in 88 to your next experience in 2016, is it going to be a linear progression continuously upward to the price of water, or will China's development and advancement and whatever, will it plateau and it won't be linear all the way up till 2050?
Well, I don't think any country is going to have the same kind of growth that China has had between that period. I mean, they went from
Even China.
No, I don't think it's going to change much. I think China has essentially arrived from a developmental standpoint. It may continue to spread throughout the country because again, these things tend to happen in the urban areas first, and then spread out to the rural areas in terms of how it happens. exactly what my experience was in Eastern Europe when I was living and working in Prague and Warsaw and Hungary to a lesser extent. Uh, the changes, the transformation from what was before the Soviet model, right, which they imposed on all the Eastern Bloc countries, into a free market happened in the financial political capitals first, not even the second cities, right?
Mm.
So it was Prague, it was Warsaw, it was Budapest. It wasn't in Poznan, for example, which is the second city in Poland, which is a big city, but not Warsaw, right? It wasn't in Krakow, although Krakow was quickly following in Warsaw in that respect. And I think in China, it's been a similar phenomenon where the major cities have evolved and changed, and there are cities that grew. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know this from a personal experience like I do in Eastern Europe, but I think it has a tendency to focus on those cities. They evolve to catching up to where the rest of the world is, which China I think has done in its major cities, and then it spreads out horizontally, if you will. So to that extent, to where rural areas are not yet developed, that's where there might be growth in China. But I don't think it's going to. I don't think there's another. I don't think it's going to continue to grow at the same rate because it's gone from zero, for all intents and purposes, to to joining the rest of the world in its major cities.
So, what about Siberia in particular? How is the development of that area going to be? What is it today, and what is it going to be in 5 years and 25 years?
Right. So the Siberian question recognizes some realities of today, and again extrapolates into the future. And one of many in Siberia and Russia generally, and in a lot of the developed in all almost all of the developed countries around the world, with the one exception being the United States, and only because of migration. Uh, the populations are falling, right? There just aren't as many people, and so when you have a country as vast as Russia, with fewer and fewer people, and less opportunity, and you still need people to do certain things, the result is things don't happen. So I think what's happening in Siberia right now is in order to continue to develop the natural resources that Russia has, they are importing people, and that's happening today. There are more and more Chinese because it's the most accessible, immediate population source, to actually just bodies to go there and do things that need to be done in the mines, in the refineries, in the oil fields, and all the other things that would lead to developing natural resources. So that is happening today.
Will Russia be importing any uh, artificial intelligence and robots from China? Because China is heavily into robotics and artificial intelligence today.
As is most countries, one level or another.
Yeah.
Well, that
Russia is probably behind in that regard,
well, that's because their resources have all been devoted to this
though.
war
Yeah.
in Ukraine.
So as far
Uh,
as their reliance on China for labor, China might send robots instead of humans.
well, that's not my story though. And the reason why is because robots are not going to uh, want independence and join the rest of China, which is essentially the play, right? So the play in the Siberian Question is recognizing this opportunity. Again, China being opportunistic, right? The Russians need people. The Chinese are willing to send people. They've got demographic issues of their own that need to be addressed, right? And so this is part of the solution is give these kids of today who, the let it rot generation that can't find jobs and there aren't jobs available. Well,
Mhm.
there might be jobs available in Siberia to help, again, continue to develop these natural resources.
Mhm.
There are all these men who can't find wives because they were part of there's a 20 million or more shortage of women, and while some do find, as we've talked about, wives from other places, they're just hanging out, not sure what to do with themselves. So send them off to Siberia. And then in the Siberian Question, because then this becomes very intentional, sprinkle in Chinese intelligence officers from the PLA, right? And then you've got people to organize those migrants over time, and you establish enough of them. And here's the Siberian Question, right? So the idea is China wants that part of the world for its own. And
Mhm.
the Siberian Question is essentially them doing the things necessary clandestinely to make that happen. right? And in the book, this project is called the Outer Manchurian Project because, in fact, the Russians, in a treaty from 1853, I think is the date, took a big chunk of Outer Manchuria for themselves from the Chinese, from the Ming Dynasty. That and they want it back because the Chinese want all their territory back. That long memory and this innate desire to address what they view as the wrongs of the century of humiliation. This is that opportunity and more.
Yeah, that raises another question for me. I'm curious what you think about it. So traditionally, from 1949 up until like 20 years ago in China, Chinese people are notoriously able to 吃苦, which means eat bitterness. They can work hard, they can work long hours, they never complain. That's why China's manufacturing was able to accelerate so fast. Now you have this generation of people who are lying flat, letting it rot, basically lazy. How is the authoritarian Chinese government going to kind of gather up these people and force them to work hard in Siberia? I mean, there has to be there. In your mind, how does that happen? Where you take these lazy people who are lying flat, who don't know how to eat business, and suddenly say, okay, well, you can go work in Siberia. Is it a forced labor movement, or how does that take place?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, Up until now, the working theory here has been that there's the opportunity is lucrative enough to attract them to want to get out of that, because the reason they're that way is because there aren't any opportunities where they are, right? And they've looked and they can't find it, and they've just given up,
Right.
right? And so this is an opportunity, right? It's a new opportunity presented to these people to go and actually earn really good money, right? To do the things that need to be done as a way to get them to go, and then bring with them organize them by, they're not going to organize themselves necessarily, or they might, but rather than let that happen naturally, actually do it very intentionally by sending, in addition to the people like you just described, also intelligence officers whose mission there is to create this excuse ultimately for China to basically give the Russians an ultimatum. We're going to cut you off if you don't give us this territory.
What are some of the numbers that you're thinking about in your head? How many of these Chinese are going to be sent over?
Millions,
Millions.
millions.
Wow.
Because right now there are not that. I mean, the total population of Siberia is probably about a million. Across the entire eastern part of Russia, which is a massive, massive, massive area, right? Between Irkutsk and Yakutsk, which are the two biggest cities, sort of one's in southern Siberia, the other one's in farther east. You're talking about less than a million people between those two cities, probably like maybe 500,000, right? And then spread across the rest of it, maybe another 500,000. So in China with its over a billion people has and that's an interesting. I saw an interesting presentation recently about whether that number is even real, but let's assume that it is, right? There's a huge amount of natural human resource that's available essentially.
Yeah, is Yakutsk. I've seen some videos on YouTube. Is that one of those coldest places on the planet places?
It is the coldest city in the world. Yes.
Yes, I've seen some YouTube videos about that.
Not
So
only in the winter, the interesting thing is in the summer it's kind of temperate, right? It's really cold in the winter, but it's not that bad in the summer.
so going back to your experience in '88, how are people are who've been living in that warm tropical climate all their lives, how are they going to acclimate to winter in Yakutsk?
Well, not all the Chinese live in the south of China. I mean, there are plenty that live in the north of China, and Beijing is, it has four seasons, right? And
Yep.
other cities in the northeastern plain, have the seasons. And again, if the opportunity is significant enough, people will go from wherever they are.
Mm. Okay, so that's so when do you think when is the release date for the Siberian Question?
Hopefully later this year. So I have a working draft The manuscript, the first draft of the 17 chapters are done.